Receive more refugees from Ukraine than any other country, while Moscow has warned its government to stay out of the war. But is there a risk of a spillover? And if so, what will be the fallout? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had a direct impact on neighbouring countries, most of whom are members of NATO. Poland has become vital in the Western effort to defend Ukraine, with some of the fighting getting close to its border. Last week, Russian forces targeted the western Ukrainian city of Lviv near the Polish border, just as the US president was visiting Poland. And according to Ukraine's military, 3 weeks after the war began, a Russian drone flew over Poland before entering Ukrainian airspace, where it was shot down. The situation has forced NATO to decide on how to respond to incidents like this inside the borders of its member states. US President Joe Biden visited Ukrainian refugees and NATO troops in the Polish capital Warsaw on Saturday. During a speech to a large crowd, he warned Russia against violating NATO territory.
Don't even think about moving on one single inch of NATO territory. We have sacred obligation. We have a sacred obligation under Article 5 to defend each and every inch of NATO territory.
Poland has had an important role since the conflict began last month. It went from rejecting migrants from the Middle East to opening its doors to those from Ukraine, hosting more than 2 million people, the largest group of Ukrainian refugees in Europe. Poland hosts NATO battle groups to deter Russia and reinforce other members when needed. And along with Romania, it's also a gateway for NATO arms supplies heading to Ukraine. Hundreds of Stinger missiles, Javelin anti-tank weapons, and other munitions have passed through its borders. He is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and a former military attaché at the US Embassy in Warsaw. In Brussels, Robert Schell, a senior fellow at the Casimir Pulaski Foundation in Poland and a former Polish diplomat and NATO official. And joining us from Oxford in England, Samuel Romani, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute.
Well, to start off with, in general, the Polish population has done a remarkable job, and the government in hosting literally now millions. So we're seeing more people migrating or refugees falling into Poland than we've seen refugee flows in this short span of time since World War II. I think it's an important point to highlight. You mentioned the migrants on the Belarus border. This is all part of the full operation that Putin initiated last summer. That hybrid warfare attack against the Polish border, those were migrants being used as weapons against Poland, destabilizing the border, and then also tying up the military force so that they can't concentrate and focus on their primary mission. But overall, generally, the Poles are very positive about what they're able to do to help their Ukrainian brothers. They see this existential crisis for them, for Ukraine, as an existential crisis for Poland, should they lose.
Poland has had the reputation of being kind of the bad boys of Europe up till then, with a lot of criticism about their moves inside Poland that were seen as trampling on the judiciary, on independent media, and backsliding over democratic norms. And yet now it is a very important player in all of this.
Well, I mean, there are, of course, nobody's perfect, and there are various issues which are, frankly, indeed, as you mentioned, to do with a dispute that the Polish government has had, for instance, with, EU institutions. But, and Poland has, and I'm Polish, the phrase actually spending more time, also can confirm that Polish political scene is quite polarized. But having said all this, there is a very strong degree of unity on this issue. It's really bipartisan. There is not that much, difference, frankly. If there's debate, it's about, if you like, the tactics. It's about the details of response. But, Poland knows the threat, and Poland has been among those countries who have been providing, a very realistic analysis of the situation. It has not always been heard sufficiently, strongly, so to speak, in international institutions. But it's not about being vindicated by the analysis. The key issue is, like you mentioned at the beginning, Poland is actually the key country in terms of both, handling of the refugee, which is crisis, which I think Poles have really rushed to help the Ukrainians, and so that's one miscalculation of Putin. But also Poland indeed is the frontline state, and it's not only hosting allied troops. Now it's about 10,000 allied troops, predominantly American, but not only, and providing, of course, the vital, essentially hub facility for the essential, defense assistance to Ukraine. But actually, Poland is also doing a lot when it comes to, increasing, for example, defense expenditure, enacting the necessary legislation. So in other words, Poland is taking not only this crisis very seriously, but it's responding. So, in a way which frankly, it would be good if it was copied by more countries, particularly in Western Europe. So that is perhaps one of the key reasons why President Biden came straight from Brussels meeting of NATO, EU, and G7 to Poland, not only to Warsaw, but also to meet U.S. troops in Rzeszów.
Samuel Romani, if we could talk about the security aspect of this, and we mentioned at the top there the risk of a spillover if this escalates into something beyond Ukraine's borders. If that does happen, Poland is likely to be very much in the eye of that storm.
Well, I think that there's certainly a grave risk of an accidental escalation that drags Poland into a broader sense of conflict. Because even though Russia claims that it's pivoted its military operation towards focusing on the liberation of Donbass, as it calls it, so moving towards eastern Ukraine, we've seen a continuation of strikes in western Ukraine. Strikes on oil depots, communications towers, S-300 air defense systems, factory and munitions factories inside Lviv, and even as well as Lutsk. And one of those strikes recently hit between 10 kilometers of the Polish border. So it's not inconceivable there could be an accidental strike that brings Poland into it. They've already had an errant missile strike that hit a Turkish ship on the first day of the war. So that kind of accident is possible. In terms of a deliberate Russian attack on Poland, I think that that's quite remote. I think in terms of risk, the countries that are most at risk are the neutral post-Soviet states, Georgia and Moldova, probably followed by Estonia, Lithuania, and Bosnia, because the Russians have threatened there, and then Poland being further removed from that.
Ray Wojcik, one thing you notice about Poland's approach to all of this as well, in contrast with some of its European and NATO partners, is that they've taken much more of a hardline approach to Russia than some of their allies. They've wanted more forceful sanctions. They've wanted more in terms of defensive assistance to the Ukrainian forces, but they've been overruled on that up to now. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, that's just part and parcel of Polish history. There's a long, problematic history in this region, and what the Russians did here, colluding with the Germans in World War II, what the Russians did by occupying Poland for 123 years, those are long memories. And the Poles never, ever, even with the NATO-Russian Founding Act in 1997, fully bought into the idea that Russia would become a flourishing democracy. And as Robert pointed out, those threat assessments that the Poles, Baltic states, and Romanians, for example, were pushing and called Russophobic by many, have been borne out to be true. So in the case of a Polish focus on defense preparedness, as Robert pointed out, not only is 3% defense spending is also announced, but as far as NATO GDP spending, that puts Poland at number 2. The United States is the only other ally that will be spending more on defense. Poland has pledged to increase their military size from approximately 140,000 territorial and active today to almost doubling or more, 300,000 troops total when you at the end of the day. And then Poland is focused on a big modernization program that predates this latest attack. The Poles are very sanguine from even before 2008 when the Russians invaded Georgia. So the Poles take this very seriously, and they're very disappointed all these years that the West Europeans mostly have a different view. A good part, if there could be set any good part, is the West Europeans are waking up. They see the Germans talking about their defense spending changes, modernizing their military, and being a more willing and able facilitator of defense on NATO's eastern flank. So those are all good things, but it's coming at a very late date. And same thing for U.S. Supplying of weapons to Ukraine. Now, as far as the big initiatives, the three that the Poles have really pushed and unfortunately have not occurred. One is the MiG-29 transfer, very disappointing how that worked out from Poland to Ukraine. The second is the no-fly zone. Poland is a big supporter of that. And then also a ground mission. Poland wanted NATO to at least consider a way to protect humanitarian quarters with a ground peacekeeping, probably more like a peacemaking mission. So all those are strong initiatives supporting Ukraine. Hopefully they'll pick up momentum.
Robert Schell, what do you make of the relationship between the EU as a whole and Poland right now, given that they become a kind of an indispensable partner in all of this? Will this newfound favor kind of embolden the government in Warsaw now?
Well, politics never stops, obviously. So there are some issues, but I think they kind of, hopefully they sort of part to be dealt separately. The important thing is, is that in Poland there is a, very, very strong support to the European Union. I mean, I think only NATO probably, gathers higher figures when it comes to opinion polls. But it's fair to say that EU as an institution has traveled a wrong road as well. I mean, there's been a lot of action, not just talk, as it used to be the case. The famous, expressing concerns, etc. EU is really a key player when it comes to sanctions, and at the moment, I would say the EU institutions have really been quite exemplary in terms of pushing forward. The problem, as always, is that of course you need all the capitals to line up, and at the moment Poland is very strongly, he's not alone of course, but arguing for going for where it really hurts the Kremlin regime, which is essentially the gas and oil exports. That is, again, you see, Poland, has done a bit more homework. I mean, the gist of it is that by the end of the year, Poland will be totally independent of Russian gas because it's taken steps to actually invest in, for instance, liquefied gas and things of that nature, alternative routes. So, of course, some other countries in Europe are slightly less prepared. But nevertheless, I think there is a gathering of momentum. And there's also, a certain kind of political example. I would just mention the fact that no matter, I know there's been some critical or even some sniping remarks from the sidelines, but the Ukrainians appreciated the fact that Poland took the lead actually in having 3 prime ministers from Poland, Czechia, and Slovenia traveling to Kiev and meet with President Zelensky, which was the only visit of that level to happen. So I think Poland is kind of showing the way. But yes, I mean, some issues related to what you mentioned, the question of the judicial system, they will need to be kind of, discussed further. But at the moment, the important thing is that there is unity among organizations, and there is a determination to actually press ahead and impose such high costs on the regime in Russia that it will reconsider what it's doing right now. But of course, one needs to support the Ukrainians in their fight, and that's also something that Warsaw is very strongly arguing for. So yes, I mean it's. The crisis brings out the best, one could say, in those who care about security and support for those victims of aggression.
Let's pick up on some of that with Samuel Romani, and I want to ask you at some stage when Ukraine is no longer dominating the headlines, if there's a negotiated peace or the war becomes one of attrition and just falls out of the spotlight, the underlying issues, the rule of law dispute with Poland, with the EU, are not going to go away, are they? I mean, those issues are going to have to be addressed.
Well, certainly. I mean, I think that Poland has certainly used and leveraged this crisis to be a vanguard in terms of dealing with Russia, and that's been a very positive thing. I mean, Poland has been able to actually steer and influence EU policy in the direction of energy, because it was one of the most dependent countries on coal coming from Russia, up to 70%. And it was made an early ban on that, and that helped steer more European countries towards at least discussing the energy embargo. We've seen Poland take the lead on a variety of other issues, from peacekeeping to arms transfers. So that leadership, that role of Poland as both a leader and an outlier is quite interesting. I think it's something that will kind of continue to persist even after this crisis, because the rule of law issues won't be going away.
Ray Wojcik, what do you make of that dynamic? There's a kind of a push and pull thing going on here between Poland and its dealings with other European partners.
Yeah, I would say two things on this point. One is, if you try to understand the position of the current government of Poland, there's two sides to the story. So the government of Poland sees their reformation or their reforms in the court system. Previously, they've tried to do some things with the media and so forth in other areas. They see that is their domain to deal with. So part of the argument with the EU, and also by extension the United States, is these are things that are domestic issues that we want to change, or things that were not reformed during the communist time. We want to reform them. So I think there's two sides of the story. It's not all about what you read in the West, in my view, that Poland is somehow an autocratic or almost an autocratic state, which I think totally overblows what the reality is on the ground here. So that's one. The other is the U.S. ambassador, relatively new, son of Zbigniew Brzezinski, Mark Brzezinski, has made it clear over and over in Washington and then here since he's arrived, that even though those issues are issues he wants to work on and deal with the Poles, there's going to be no daylight in between on security defense issues and what's the mission at hand right now. So those issues are not going to play a role or a primary role in any of the discussions going on with the United States and Poland. In fact, if anything, things are speeding up on security defense as far as weapons transfers to Poland and then transfers from Poland to Ukraine.